Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.
Okay, now we're ready for World Watchers. It's just about 2 minutes after 8, and this is KAZU FM, and I hope everything is all right with you during this holiday season. And it's been a hard week. Went to a funeral today of a very beautiful young woman who passed away, and in between all the research and newspapers, there's some very happy things and some very sad things that happen that you have to take in stride during your daily life. All of us do. It's a shock, and it's disconcerting, and it's upsetting, but I don't know why it happens. It happens, and she was part of this Monterey Peninsula, and her husband, David Mean, was my first producer over at KLRB when I first went on the air 11 years ago. So we've been friends that long, a long time, and we'll begin our program now. This is broadcast number 574, and it is December the 6th, 1982. Last year, in keeping with a resume of what was taking place a year ago, tape number 522, December the 6th, 1981, I was talking about the anniversary of the murder of John Lennon. It's 2 years now. And that broadcast brought up to date the espionage intrigue around Mark David Chapman, the fellow that shot John Lennon. And I went into the Richard Allen Japanese connections. In case any of you want these tapes, they are available. I got many calls this week for tapes on the John Lennon murder, and it's available. I did a whole series on it. And I talked about Mark David Chapman's trips to Geneva, Switzerland, and Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, with the American military, and his contacts in Geneva, and with the Laotian tribesmen that were brought over by Edwin Wilson and the CIA and Robert Vesco, and his London safe houses and the Beirut, Lebanon connections, training for terrorism and shooting, and the links of Senator Strom Thurmond, of Senate Judiciary to John Mitchell, and to people that would want John Lennon murdered, and how he had wanted him sent out of the country at the time of the nominations of Richard Nixon going back to 1972, and then his current visits and contacts with the likes of Frank Churchill and the assassination teams. That was just a year ago tonight that we talked about those things, and it's 2 years since John Lennon was murdered. A story, I want to do some short items with you and then get on to two major subjects tonight. A story in the San Francisco Chronicle, alleged Nazi gets a stay of deportation. Mr. Artukovich, Andrija, A-N-D-R-J-A, Artukovich, he's 83 years old now. He lives down at Seal Beach, down near San Clemente, got another stay from being deported from this country. John Kennedy wanted him kicked out before John Kennedy was murdered, and every time there's an order to kick him out of this country, he seems to get another chance to hang around. This is the guy that was charged with murdering at least 300,000 people, even more. I've mentioned his name before, and I wondered of the contacts that John DeLorean had with his friend Mr. Nezeth down in that territory, and were there any links to this particular Artukovich? I mentioned it several weeks ago. Well, just this week, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals said, well, you can still stay, and I think he's so important that they can't deport him. There's an obituary in it was in the New York Times this past week, November 23rd, almost 2 weeks ago, on Howard R. Bloomquist, B-L-U-O-O-M-Q-U-I-S-T. Interesting, the background of certain people that you never would know until they pass away, and then the New York Times has these marvelous obituaries. He was vice president and director of Warner Lambert and Company. That was the cover for Otto von Bolschwing and the Nazi Gehlen operation. And Elmer Bost of that group was the godfather of Richard Nixon's career and in charge of the American Cancer Society. He was also vice president of W.R. Grace and Company. I've mentioned them many weeks. The partner, J. Peter Grace, with Otto Ambrose from I.G. Farben, from Auschwitz, from the poison gases, and the Flick group from Nazi Germany, the Frederick Flick group that's put $390 million into Mr. Strauss in Bavaria for elections. They own 1/3 of Grace Company. He was vice president of W.R. Grace, and he also is vice president of General Food, which includes Jell-O and Kool-Aid. And I thought of Jonestown. So we have Warner Lambert, which is the American Cancer Society, W.R. Grace, which was the Zyklon B, associated with Zyklon B, and the extermination gas, and Jonestown with the cyanide, the Kool-Aid. And there were parallels of Jonestown to Nazi Germany. So I thought the three boards that he was vice president of were very interesting. Also, I've been talking quite a bit about the Vatican scandals. I'm not going to pursue the Vatican tonight. I'll give them a rest, but an article in the Houston Post this week, the United States Bishop Paul Marcinkus, the one who's hiding inside the Vatican, who refuses to answer a subpoena, turned it back, would be arrested by the Italian government for flight of capital out of Italy. He is going to be promoted to cardinal to run the daily affairs of the Vatican, even though all this scandal is going on. Another proposal, this is another article from the Houston Post, a proposal would allow naturalized citizens to become president, and it names specifically Mr. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. Now, the man who proposed this to change the Constitution is none other than Senator Thomas Eagleton, Democrat of Missouri. Eagleton caused quite a furor. His past history did at the time of the elections in 1972 because George McGovern wanted him for the vice president, and then it turned out that he had been subjected to quite a bit of electric shock in a mental institution at one time, so they had to drop his name as the vice president, the suggested vice president. Maybe they did some mind control in the hospital. Maybe there's some electrodes in Mr. Eagleton's head where they said, we'll change the Constitution for Kissinger. Goodness knows, I think he got more than electric shock in the mental hospital. I think they must have programmed him, a Democrat, somewhere in his little head with one of those implanted electrodes to surface and what the former people who were born in other countries, and specifically it's for Henry Kissinger to become president of the United States. Now, last week I briefly mentioned an article in the New York Times, one subject on the Vatican, but I'm going to switch from that to Nazi Germany, and I mentioned that three main bankers were investigating the scandals of the bank of Ambrosiano and the $1.2 billion that was missing out of dummy fronts in Panama. They still won't say where the money went, and much money missing out of Luxembourg and 200 banks in Europe, Liechtenstein. And in the New York Times, the writer Henry Kamm, K-A-M-M, said the fourth banker to help the Vatican is of high international standing, Mr. Hermann Abs. I mentioned him last week, Hermann ABS of West Germany, is added to the original panel of three to emphasize the importance that the Vatican is attaching to professional supervision of its bank. Mr. Abs is a prominent Roman Catholic layman, and I mentioned that last week. So this week I wanted to bring some references on the background, current references on the background of Mr. Abs, so you would understand his expertise of what it means for him at this time to be appointed in charge of the entire Catholic Church's money to see where it goes. In the book by James Martin, All Honorable Men, it was published by Little Brown in Boston in 1950, he has quite a bit on Mr. Abs, but he also has a paragraph on page 70 about IG Farben. Now, Farben is important because Abs was on the board of IG Farben, and Pope John Paul II, as I said, worked for IG Farben. And in this book, he explains the IG Farben New Order, capital N, capital O, the New Order plan was initiated by the Farben management to show the German High Command how corporate expansion of the IG company as a business could be geared to the interests of the German government for the purpose of establishing German power all over the world. They told the German government under IG could take over the world. It was the result of 20 years of close work between the management of industry and government. Now, this is the industry that imported slave labor. I don't have to go into the details of that. You can get the books on Nazi Germany and the rooms for gassing and the trains to the extermination centers. Now, this was the company, IG Farben. in return, and see if this sounds like Ronald Reagan, in return for these corporations and this one helping Germany, Germany gave more assistance to the growth of organizations like IG Farben. They got special tax concessions favoring the growth of combines, which you're seeing today, modification of corporation law to give the management free hands, and government subsidies for special projects, just as J. Peter Grace got for what I call the body bags, $2 billion for a special project to convey something from Colorado to the ocean. Okay, the body bag. So that these combines got this special benefit, and among the banks that were given money included the Deutsche Bank of Mr. Apps, ABS. And this book, All Honorable Men, says none of this development, none of it would be possible without loans from the Allied nations. Now, tomorrow is the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, so keep in mind what was going on between the bankers and the German government before we were attacked and continuously after we were attacked until the war was over. Now, it's a new book by Paul Manning, new last year, called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. There are several paragraphs that I want to read to you. I usually paraphrase material and outline it to bring it in, but it's so important that you hear the exact wording of what Mr. Manning is saying, Paul Manning, about Martin Bormann. He said the concern of the Nazis after Gustav Franz Wagner was seen in Brazil proved that to the Nazis that they were home free, that they wouldn't be extradited, and that the cover when Willy Brandt was the president of Germany and this Nazi was seen down in Brazil, when they didn't want him back and they gave a story that Martin Bormann was dead, Willy Brandt, this was a passport to freedom for Martin Bormann at this time, and then they could continue doing their work, and Martin Bormann is very much alive. In this book, he says, while Germany's bankers were collectively responsible for the financing of Hitler's war effort, the German bankers, the dean of them all is Hermann Joseph Apps, ABS. Money was his life, and his astuteness in banking and international financial manipulations enabled the Deutsche Bank to serve as a leader in fueling ambitions and the accomplishments of Adolf Hitler and Martin Bormann. His dominance, Mr. Apps, was retained when the Federal Republic of Germany picked it up after the war was over. He was still chairman of the Deutsche Bank. He was still director of IG Farben when the war was over, and others such as Daimler Benz, which again bought into the J. Peter Grace Company. They sold part of that to put the money into J. Peter Grace. And the influence of Mr. Apps is described in this book, how he brought art financiers to this country like the Tysons, and under the cover of other front organizations, they created like art exhibits to make them popular with the United States. Another important section of this book about Mr. Apps says that by the 1970s, this is well after, just before Watergate's in, after Robert Kennedy and John Kennedy are murdered, the West Germans concluded that to influence United States public opinion, they would set new events such as Willy Brandt announcing in June of 1972 at the Harvard University that Germany would give $47 million to establish a foundation in honor of the Marshall Plan. The overriding function of the German George C. Marshall Research Foundation at Harvard is public relations to cosmetize German industrialists and bankers whose corporations worked so successfully throughout the Third Reich. In October 1978, that's not long ago, the Marshall Foundation was utilized as the platform for Dr. Hermann Apps, now honorary president of the Deutsche Bank, to address businessmen and bankers and members of the Foreign Policy Association in New York City on problems and prospects of American-German economic cooperation. Now, the meeting was chaired by John J. McCloy, whose name comes through all of this. John J. McCloy was a member of the Warren Commission who hid the Nazis, who worked for Chase Manhattan Bank, the High Commissioner of Germany who released the Nazis. He brought Mr. Apps over here, the Wall Street banker and lawyer. He had close workings with Mr. Apps, Dr. Apps, when McCloy was U.S. High Commissioner for Germany during the post-war Reconstruction. That's when he let all the top Nazis out. He had close working. At that time, Hermann Apps, and remember, he's on the board of directors of IG Farben, was the executive of the Deutsche Bank after the war. He was directing and spending the American Marshall Plan money in West Germany as chairman of the Reconstruction Loan Corporation of the Federal Republic of Germany. So what you have is a man who funded Hitler, funded Martin Bormann, who's in charge of George C. Marshall's money to reconstruct loans to corporations. With these people on the dais that day were former Secretary of the Treasury Henry Cabot Lodge, and that's another man that Otto von Bolschwing worked for when he came to this country and got his citizenship, between Warner Lambert and Henry Cabot Lodge, the Lodge family. And this John J. McCloy was the U.S. commissioner who released the top Nazis. And the reason I bring it out is that isn't something that happened a long, long time ago. We are in the throes of bankruptcy. I cut out 4 major articles this week on the international collapse of the banks that maybe I'll share with you next week, but it's the wrong thing to do just a week before Christmas. The major stories: Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, there are various magazine articles. There are 4 large articles on the collective debt the United States has given out, $750 billion to, and Ronald Reagan offered several billion to Brazil on a 90-day loan. What can they do? They can't even grow poppies in 90 days and sell them. How can you give a loan of several billion? No transportation in this country, rapid transportation. As he said, we have to raise our gas taxes. The roads are collapsing. The trucking rates go up. The prices go up. The inflation. He's out there giving money that they can't pay back. These bankers collapsed the American banks, and the capital, I'm sure, that was missing, they have salted away in many, many places. In this book, on Martin Bormann and Mr. Apps, it says at the apex of the vast financial and economic administration structure was Reichsleiter Martin Bormann, Reichsleiter, Martin Bormann. He had his grip on German finance. He took charge of the finances of the Fuhrer. And he had the funds of the Reich Chancellery that funded Adolf Hitler's salary. His friendship and association with Dr. Hermann Joseph Apps predated Apps' move into the management of the Deutsche Bank. Dr. Apps was a partner in the prestigious bank, the private bank of Delbrück, Schickler and Company in Berlin, Schickler. And the Reich Chancellery in Berlin was its largest account. It was through this account that Adolf Hitler got his salary as Chancellor of the Reich. Martin Bormann, who controlled the Reich Chancellery, and he's alive today, was absolute the moment he succeeded Rudolf Hess. I'm reading from the book on Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, and tying it into Dr. Hermann Apps, who has just been assigned in charge of the IG Farben Pope to handle the Vatican finances for a member of the board of IG Farben. Going back to this paragraph, Martin Bormann, whose control of the Reich Chancellery was the absolute the moment he succeeded Rudolf Hess, maintained his cordial relationship with the Berlin banker. Dr. Apps moved to the Deutsche Bank December 30th, 1937, where he became the first member of the board of management, later the chairman of the most powerful bank in Germany, and he still is there today, 82 years old. He saw into their new areas of financial expansion and power throughout the world. Mr. Bormann knew that his relationship with Hermann Apps, and Bormann is alive today and Apps is alive, would tighten as his own power grew. Remaining on friendly terms with the Third Reich's leading banker was a contentment. He knew in 1943 that his Nazi banking committee would be well established. And this goes into the next part of this program. In 1943, with his Nazi banking committee well established, as I say, and by 1943, and that the means to ultimately take the reins of finance unto himself. Bormann could do this. Throughout this committee and throughout the power that flowed from Hitler to himself, Bormann could set a new Nazi state policy when the time was ripe for general transfer of capital, for gold and stocks and bearer bonds to safety in neutral nations. What were the neutral nations? Argentina, Madrid, the Scandinavian countries, to Ireland, where the fascist Odessa headquarters were set up, South America, Uruguay, Paraguay, Mexico. To conclude some statements in this book, Martin Bormann, like Adolf Hitler, had no illusions that their victory was going to be on the battlefield. Hitler settled in his own mind a different kind of victory, compromise and peace with the adversaries, and to Martin Bormann he commented in 1943, "They will not make peace for us now, but in the summer of 43," and that's that important year I keep bringing out, Hitler requested Martin Bormann to call a meeting of the SS security chiefs. Present was Hitler, Martin Bormann, Himmler, Mueller of the Gestapo, and Schellenberg, head of the SS Foreign Intelligence. Of all of these, I'm not sure which ones are dead. Okay? I have to look up Schellenberg. I don't remember, but that was a meeting that Hitler called. Now, today, Mr. Abs lives in Frankfurt. And this book on Mr. Abs and on Bormann says he resides in Frankfurt. He has not lost his touch. The Deutsche Bank is the largest in Europe, the third largest in the world. Hasn't lost his touch for international investment on behalf of his clients in West Germany. He recently bought 2 skyscrapers in Houston, Texas, the Pennzoil and Shell buildings in Houston. As Vice President Ferdinand Krier of the Deutsche Bank said, our clients believe that American real estate is an attractive proposition at this time. Our goal is more opportunities for our clients, including the purchase of the massive World Trade Center in lower Manhattan. So this gentleman, 82 years old, is still working, and now this prestigious appointment recognized by the Pope. He entertains Arafat, but that's just a little tiny thing. He is a very powerful man who has a powerful bank, and Martin Bormann is alive, and a lot of the flight of the capital, the gold, the stocks, the bonds, leaving this country are being salted away by the very people that sold this country out. And it is a shock. I haven't seen anything in a major newspaper about that appointment of Mr. Abs. Just one more comment. When the banks after Pearl Harbor, at the time we went into war, again, it's just an anniversary tomorrow, December the 7th, when we went into Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt said that the United States would be at war with Japan and Germany, and the American banks in France became under the German control at that time. The 2 exceptions were Morgan Bank and Chase of Manhattan. Both got special treatment through the intercession of Dr. Hermann Joseph Abs of the Deutsche Bank, financial advisor to the German government, because Dr. Abs was very close to Lord Shawcross of London, the city of London, Shawcross, Lord Shawcross. He was a British financial leader in London. Now, Shawcross had been serving as an advisor to the Morgan Bank, to the French one, and to the German. And because Mr. Abs was in close contact with Chase Manhattan and the London banks, they continued throughout the entire war. And to top that off, Mr. Shawcross later became chief prosecutor for the United Kingdoms at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. He had many friendly conversations with banker Dr. Abs, who was under house arrest in 1945. So the concession of the British and Chase Manhattan was done with Hitler's, the man writing the paychecks for the Reich Chancellery. He continued during the war with Chase Manhattan and with the London banks. He was arrested as a war criminal. The chief investigator of Nuremberg was the man that was banking with Dr. Apps. And from Chase Manhattan, John J. McCloy released the Nazis. And the problems that I studied along these lines began in 1963, November 22nd, when I wanted to know who killed John Kennedy, because John J. McCloy and Alan Dulles were on the Warren Commission, along with Leon Jaworski, one of the investigators at Dachau and Nuremberg, and also Gerald Ford of the CIA was to later, I didn't know then, was to become president. And as I say, the Nazi mob connections to the murder of John Kennedy were concealed by the very people who had been doing all this trickery during World War II. Well, not only John Kennedy died, but add up the war statistics. Was it 80 million from all the different countries? These bloody battles were going on all over. There was a movie last night on TV on Bataan. Little do they know, the dead or the survivors, that that was a game plan, and they were the pawns. If they all died, it didn't matter. If they survived, it didn't matter. The money kept on through the banks, and that is the fact of life until you take control of your own lives and have some dignity or self-respect for yourself. You are cannon fodder to them. For those of you that didn't hear it a half hour before, before I came on the air, locally, the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies was talking about atomic bombs and missiles and nuclear freeze. All of that was brought over to us. Not after, it was after Pearl Harbor when the war was over, and all you see in the newspaper and discussions is not the word peace, but the word war. How should you do it? Where do you distribute the weapons? Who will hit first? Will there be medical care? Who covers for us? Will they see where our bombs are placed? Which ones goes faster? Who's in touch of them? Will a person be crazy and make a mistake? All of this idiocy, billions of dollars of bankruptcy into playing a game like Russian roulette. I used to think the people that held a pistol to their head and played Russian roulette were totally out of their mind. And I have a friend we discuss every day. The news is totally insane. I don't know how people live with it, but unless you recognize it as insanity, and these people are still alive. That is the amazing thing. Those people that planned all this are doing just as they planned. The minute they knew they couldn't take the Soviet Union in 1943, January 8th, 1943, and the dates keep going back to these same names, these same banks, the same people. The Pope that worked for Solvay Chemical, IG Farben at Auschwitz, now giving the entire Vatican to the Reich Bank and to the head of the Deutsche Bank. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. The history books don't tell it, that the New York Times can tell you this man got an appointment. A lot of people suggest on the program that I use names too fast and that I don't give a background of the people. And I say, well, look at the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or any newspaper article. They tell you that Henry Kissinger went to Germany today, but they don't tell you what kind of a snake he is. He doesn't crawl, he flies, but they don't give you the background. And once you study the background and look up who they are and read books and hopefully listen to this program every week, maybe get an idea of who's really running the world. And maybe these Catholics that are against the atomic bomb should be notified about Mr. Herman Apps and the appointment for the Vatican money, because those people pushed slave labor, pushed genocide, didn't blush at the horrendous murders and tortures, relished in it, planned factories where they could use people until they died, like Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger at Pooneman. They worked them till they were skeletons with no food and then put them in ditches and brought in the next batch. Is this the kind of a world that we're going to face in the future? Yes, I think so, and people better wise up. That's the purpose of my doing my research every week, is to call attention to these situations, and they're very alive in the news today. Now, we're going to take a 1-minute break here. This is KAZU FM. And I'm going to ask you, if possible, those of you who listen to the station, to, if you haven't sent in a check, I'm not asking those who did, but those who haven't donated money to the station, it would be nice to remember the station. We've gotten some very nice checks, incidentally, and I appreciate that. You can send them to me, or you can write box KAZU Box 206, Pacific Grove, California, 939. Live on the air, but we do make a tape cassette. As I say, it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, and it's broadcast number 574, December the 6th, 1982. Now, I'm going to discuss a favorite subject that I haven't updated for many of you in a long time, KRAEMER versus KRAEMER. And briefly, I'm going to give you about 1 minute background in case you haven't heard the broadcast, because there's still confusion in people's minds when I talk about KRAEMER versus KRAEMER. In simplistic forms, or to reduce it down to this 1 minute, Adolf Hitler had a chief of staff named FRITZ KRAEMER. He was in charge of the Battle of the Bulge, the Malmedy massacres, the Panzer, the 6th Division, and he worked with top Nazis that were later released out with the help of the American government. All were released, his co-patriots, Mr. Piper, Mr. Dietrich, and so forth. And this KRAEMER of Hitler's, after he sat in the docket as prisoner 33, became a non-person, and there's no record of him in any history book afterwards. Now, the United States had a FRITZ KRAEMER, and he was from Germany. He was from Nazi Germany and then Mussolini's Italy. He came to the United States in the spring of 1939, the same year that Otto von Bolschwing from the Krupp organization, who was to do massive espionage for Adolf Hitler, was in the United States with William Donovan in 1939. This other KRAEMER came here, and he recruited Henry Kissinger, took him back to Europe, and I've done many, many tapes and hours on these two KRAEMERs, because I believe they're the same man. I believe the plans officer for the chief of our Pentagon, the chief advisor to the Pentagon, up till about 2 years ago when he retired, is Hitler's chief of staff. And I'm waiting for evidence to disprove this belief, because I've based it on many, many books, and I've been searching and having people searching. But today I want to share with you some information I got from a listener who takes these broadcasts up in Canada that may break the story of the KRAEMER saga for us. I was very excited about this week. This listener to World Watchers sent a chapter from a book that I never would have looked for in the library in a million years. It's called The Adventures of a Bystander by Peter Drucker, D-R-U-C-K-E-R, published in 1979. And the chapter he sent to me is called The Man Who Invented Kissinger. That is the man who Mr. Eagleton wants to become president of the United States, so we better know who invented Kissinger. Now, this is about FRITZ KRAEMER. Mr. Peter Drucker was born in Vienna. He went to a Frankfurt University at the same time IG Farben's headquarters and Mr. Apps in Frankfurt, Germany, and the Deutsche Bank. He was with KRAEMER in Frankfurt, and he seems to take responsibility for bringing FRITZ KRAEMER to this country. And in this chapter, I'll just read you or share with you a few sections. He says that FRITZ KRAEMER's mother was the sole daughter of a chemical manufacturer in the Ruhr region, and of course, that would be IG Farben. They had the monopoly of the chemicals in Germany at the time. His brother Fritz's brother, he has a brother named Wilhelm, who's a surgeon in Edinburgh, Scotland. That's new information. I knew that the British apprehended him as a possible Nazi spy during the war at the time that FRITZ KRAEMER was allowed into our U.S. Army intelligence. He has a brother who's in Scotland. His father rose to the top of the legal hierarchy and lived in Dusseldorf as the director of public prosecution for the entire Rhineland. And I've mentioned before that the hardest job that Adolf Hitler had from the end of World War II, from the 1919 up to 1924, was to pervert all the courts so that the murderers got out and the innocent were locked up, and there were a series of 400 murders of political people. Now, he was the director of public prosecution for the entire Rhineland, an ultra-nationalist with close ties to the emerging Nazi movement. Fritz's mother kept a home during the war in Frankfurt. She didn't leave Nazi Germany, and he had a wife and a new baby, and he left them with his mother when he came to the United States. Now, this author is saying, and he's a well-known author, he's written many books, Peter Drucker, many years during World War II, I had to explain again and again why KRAEMER was not a Nazi and could not be a Nazi because he was a genuine conservative. papa, mama, brother, but not him. And he tells how KRAEMER enlisted in the American Army. Now, he says to fight Nazis, but then it gets really funny as he goes on. He says KRAEMER never explained his political convictions or his philosophy, but he had several goals. One, to be the political advisor to the chief of the general staff of the U.S. Army, which he did get, and the other was to be the political mentor of a great foreign secretary, which was Henry Kissinger, which he got. And this man brought him to the country, and those were to be his two goals. When Hitler came to power in 1933, KRAEMER, according to this author, Mr. Drucker, finished his law studies in international law in 1933. That's when Hitler came to power. He had married a Swedish girl, Britta. They attended the international law seminar. He then went to Mussolini's Italy. In 1939, in the spring of 1939, he came to the United States and left his wife and new baby with his mother, who was not bothered by the Nazi regime at any time, living there with some children in near Dusseldorf, I guess near the husband in that area. They were separated, but the mother in 1939 had the wife and baby. He came here in September 1939. Oh, no, he came in the spring of 39, pardon me. But in September, the war began in Europe. We know that, how Hitler invaded Poland, September 1939. 2 years later, Pearl Harbor began, again, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Fritz KRAEMER enlisted in the American Army as a private. Father over there in Germany with the Nazis, mother over there in Germany with the Nazis. He's gone to school till 1933 in Vienna when Hitler came to power, and then to Mussolini's Italy. Now he's in the United States. Now, this is the clue to the thing that I've been studying, the KRAEMER versus KRAEMER, that is very good. I never would have found it in this book. This man who brought him to this country, who's known him since college, since Frankfurt, should know him better than anybody else. He brought him here. Okay, his dreams, he knows, his goals. He said he was in the battlefield. He received a battlefield commission in his regiment's first combat action, and thereafter rose rapidly. Lie. I don't believe he was in any single combat action in the United States. He says when the war ended, he was either a colonel or a brigadier general. Lie. He wasn't anything like that, and I've written to Army Intelligence, the U.S. Army, and 3 different stations or 4 offices, and I'll share them with you. Lie. He wasn't a colonel or brigadier general, but Hitler's Fritz KRAEMER was a brigadier general, okay, or a top colonel. He was on Patton's staff and assistant commander of the division that seized the Remagen Bridge that first crossed the Rhine. Now, this may be complicated for you that don't know the subject. It says he was on General Patton's staff. Hitler's Fritz KRAEMER was on Patton's staff when the war was over. He has put him on Patton's staff at the bridge. Now, the Army told me that Fritz KRAEMER, U.S. Fritz KRAEMER, was in 7 different countries, including Germany. And I said, what dates was he in Germany? And I believe that he went back and forth, and the record shows he did, to all these countries during the war. And as the war was winding down, he was in Germany when Patton was at that bridge at the Rhine. Hitler's KRAEMER was there, and he had been working with the American Army, had recruited Henry Kissinger in the American Army, and at that point, he was taken in as a prisoner of war. He wasn't with the Allies because he probably had on a German uniform, so they had to put him with Mr. Piper and Mr. Dietrich and Otto Skorzeny and all of those that got out, and worked with Martin Bormann instantly as soon as they were out. So he probably was doing a double thing when Patton came, because that was the deciding point of that particular battle. And the reason the Battle of the Bulge took place and the Malmedy Massacre took place was they were stalling the war 7 months to get the gold and the silver and the art and the diamonds out to start the Bormann Brotherhood, so that Mr. Abs could distribute the capital as the Deutsche Bank chief, which was his role with the Marshall Plan and with his own bank when the war was over. Now, this Mr. Drucker says 4 days later, When the war was over, Mr. KRAEMER was in the little town where his mother was with her little school, and as a sheer miracle, his mother, his wife, and his son survived. Sheer miracle, nothing. The Allies knew not to bomb IG Farben. They knew not to bomb Auschwitz. They knew everything that was going on. Mr. Drucker says, and then Fritz KRAEMER attained the first of his goals. He resigned his commission and turned civilian and became political advisor in Europe for the Chief of Staff for the U.S. Army. Now, I have our American KRAEMER, 1945 to 1948, working with the Army. But it says he resigned his commission. But this one has him, he wasn't processed out. He was still working for the Army. He says he became a civilian, and our United States Army says he was still in. So that's another lie, but this man knows him better than anybody, so we have to hold this up. He attended both the War College, he taught there. His office at the Pentagon got larger. Soon he's in a suite occupied by the Chief of Staff of the United States Army with a private connecting door to the Chief's own room, the United States Army. That's how important he was. Now, he picks up this Mr. KRAEMER was friendly with Henry Kissinger. He met him when they were both in the Army and Army intelligence. During basic training, Henry Kissinger had heard about a lecture of the European War, and he knew about Fritz KRAEMER in basic training. Can you imagine basic training in the South teaching about Fritz KRAEMER? The question Kissinger asked, he was so impressed with KRAEMER that, and KRAEMER met him, that he became KRAEMER's protege, and KRAEMER took Henry Kissinger after the war and said, Henry, gentlemen don't go to City College, go to Harvard. He arranged for Kissinger's admission to Harvard, and if I don't have time this week, I'm going to continue the career of Henry Kissinger, the killer, the assassination teams, starting with the murder of Mossadegh in Iran and overthrowing Guatemala and like 30 or 70 other countries. You can have your choice which ones they influence. Henry, don't go to City College, go to Harvard. He got his admission to Harvard, this man, and he was put in as a favorite student by leading government professors. They fawned over him, and Henry Kissinger stayed close to his mentor, Fritz KRAEMER. He got his first teaching position at Harvard. What has not been published in Kissinger's thoughts, as well as his actions of the U.S. Secretary of State under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, are pure KRAEMER. This is from this book about the mentor of Henry Kissinger. Every thought in that German's head that they would want us to have as president is KRAEMER. And you have to go back to the background. Is this KRAEMER the chief of staff for Hitler, who has pumped that arrogant little punt, Henry Kissinger, to where he is? Every thought of his actions when he worked for Nixon and Ford is pure KRAEMER. The enemy, KRAEMER is the enemy of publicity of any kind. He's never written or published anything except at Frankfurt University between 1929 and 1933. Why is he the enemy of publicity? Because his face will match the docket 33, prisoner 33. He isn't seen, he isn't photographed. Can you imagine a man influencing, taking into the Army Henry Kissinger, dumping him there with the chief war criminals after the war, and having a role in getting to Harvard and into the Pentagon and chief of staff, and we are not even knowing the biography of this man? And this book goes on that every idea that he has is important behind his Henry Kissinger's success. But Fritz KRAEMER goes on, has no time for fools. Kissinger and KRAEMER get along beautifully, and he believes that a man should have somebody behind the scenes, no charisma and so forth, nothing phony, no abomination. He should work quietly behind the scenes. This is the story of Henry Kissinger from the man who put him where he is, Peter Drucker, Adventures of a Bystander, published in 1979. Now, after I got that role, and I have the Pentagon military documents that I sent for and from various parts of the Army, I got out the book by Ladislas Farrago, The Last Days of Patton. This was published by McGraw-Hill in 1981, and it tells how Patton, after the Battle of the Bulge, this whole special division was created in January 1945, the 15th Army, by a Lieutenant General Leonard T. Gerow, G-E-R-O-W. And he went on to be head of the War College, the job that Patton wanted. And Patton was taken over to Germany, to Bavaria. And in his custody, according to Farrago, in his custody and care were assembled the great captains of the defunct German army and officers, Hitler's top men. Patton always professed to respect, even across the barriers of war, these great people. He came to regard them as akin with admiration and affection and sympathy. This is after the ovens are open, after the bodies are exposed. The story is told. He has sympathy and affection for them, and his sympathy grew. Here, working with him, were the erudite people of Hitler's group, Hasso van Montefiore, Manteufel, Kurt Student, that's the man who betrayed the Battle of Arnhem with Prince Bernhard, who formed the Bilderbergers for the money people who meet to slice up countries. Prince Bernhard, from I.G. Farben, again from Hitler's Germany, who married Queen Juliana. Here in the Institute of Advanced Military Studies was Fritz KRAEMER, Hitler's Fritz KRAEMER, along with heads of the Panzer divisions. The Russians, according to, this is General Patton teaching these people, the Russians still bothered them. Anyone who says there won't be a future war is can I say it on the air? I'll say a damn fool, and he uses the other word. Patton devoured anti-Russian literature his brother was sending from Boston, and he had a school. So the key word here is Patton respected these people, he cared for them, and here in his custody, working for him now was Fritz KRAEMER. And that's where Fritz KRAEMER from Nazi Germany worked for Patton. And he had, as I say, picked up in that German uniform. But when the war was out, one book says he worked for Patton. And this book says he worked for Patton. And I believe more and more every day that it is the same person. Now, I wrote to my Congressman Leon Panetta. I've had a running correspondence in the past year with the Pentagon about this Fritz KRAEMER, and I got a letter from Leon Panetta from California, September the 9th, 1982, and he said, Dear Mae, thanks for your additional material on Dr. F.G. Fritz KRAEMER, Plans Officer for the Chief of Staff of U.S. Army. I have contacted U.S. Army Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and was informed that a number of Dr. KRAEMER's papers are maintained in the Institute's archives. Additionally, I'm informed requests for copies of the material should be directed to Dr. Richard J. Summers, S-O-M-M-E-R-S, U.S. Army Military History Institute, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, 17013. I wrote October the 9th and to Richard Summers, Ph.D., and he just wrote back this last week. Dear Ms. Brussell, thank you for your letter of October 9th concerning the stations of Fritz KRAEMER from 1944 to 1946. I had asked him which countries he was in specific dates, because the military told me he was in 7 different countries. I regret to inform you that the Military History Institute has no information on that subject. The plans officer of the Pentagon, a man that Mr. Drucker says was a general, was a high-up American military, who went through the battles with Patton. I mean, in one book, the man who brought him here and knew him from Frankfurt is giving us this glorious battle, and there's no information on him. U.S. Department of Army. My congressman told me they would send it to me, and they didn't. Earlier in July, I wrote the Department of Army in Fort George, Maryland, U.S. Army Intelligence, and they said to determine the existence of Army Intelligence investigative material concerning F.G. KRAEMER. They made a search. They searched everywhere. There's no Army Intelligence investigative records identifiable with Fritz KRAEMER. Again, this is the man that Mr. Drucker from Vienna and from Frankfurt, who comes to the United States and then brings Fritz with him and then produces Henry Kissinger. There's no Army Intelligence at all in Fort George, Maryland, but they suggest that you write to the Defense Investigative Service. So I wrote to the Defense Investigative Service, and those of you who remember this, but this is important and must be repeated because the letter I got this week from the Army, that Carlisle, they will not send on anything about KRAEMER, and the importance of the Bormann app's promotions into the Vatican. And KRAEMER's protege even suggested in the Newsweek this week that he maybe could become president of the United States. Now, Defense Investigative Service had written to me in July 28th in reference to Mr. Fritz KRAEMER. They said they had some material that he was a non-commissioned officer. That's hardly the general that we were hearing about from Mr. Drucker. From September to 1944 to April 1945, he served overseas. So he was in the Army. He wasn't out in 1945 till to April 45, and then he continued up to October 47. He was overseas during the war, and I mentioned before, Scotland, England, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. And I asked the Army, what dates was he in Germany? That's a fair question, but they didn't say. It says from 19 April 1945, and the war was over in May 1945, to 20 October 1947, he continued to serve overseas in Europe with headquarters 84th Infantry Division headquarters, 1st Armored Division, and this was the European Theater Intelligence School and Command. So he was not discharged. It says from October 21st, 1947 to 24th of February, he served in the Army, discharged in Brooklyn. He was in the Ground General School at Fort Riley, Kansas earlier. But up through this whole period, he went into military instruction in the Army in February 1948 and was appointed a first lieutenant. So if you catch a man of Drucker's stature, incidentally, he is a man who's written many books. He's a financial advisor to the multinational corporations, General Motors, the DeLorean Company, and others. And he's a very important man, Ford Motor Company, ITT. He taught the multinationals for the IG Farben how to combine, how to set their forces, how to make these combinations. I'm sure he's the genius. He's the financial genius of a lot that is going on, as I say, the author of many books, and describes this man who created the Henry Kissinger and talks about KRAEMER. But if you catch him in one lie, such as when KRAEMER was in the Army, or what his commission was, or what his battle was, but he reveals that he worked on Patton staff. And then you take another book that Hitler's KRAEMER worked on Patton staff. I think you'll see what I've been driving at for the last year on working on KRAEMER. From St. Louis, Missouri, they gave me the dates: Army of the United States, 1945 to February 1948, honorably discharged first lieutenant. So that is Mr. KRAEMER, and he was not discharged earlier into civilian life. The Army has him up to 1948. That is the date that the other KRAEMER with Patton could have gotten out of the Dachau docket. All of them, the main ones, were out, the trials in 1946 December. They could have all gotten off the hook. Now, in conclusion, we have about 5 more minutes. I just want to do a little bit from that absolutely brilliant article in Atlantic Monthly this month by Seymour Hersh. It is a wonderful article on Kissinger, Nixon, and Chile, and I think if you read it, even though I share some of it with you, it will give you a view of what's going on with Mr. Haig, Alexander Haig, and Henry Kissinger. He doesn't mention KRAEMER, but remember that Kissinger is the protege, and as Mr. Drucker said, every thought in Kissinger's head is KRAEMER, 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 and the family was IG Farben and Nazi background. In the article called The Price of Power, a few sentences to update the anniversary of Kennedy's death and to remind you what goes on in the world, and then I'll get back to other parts of this article with you, hopefully next week and each week. He said Richard Nixon specifically ordered the CIA to get rid of Salvador Allende. Richard Helms, the CIA director, had no doubt in his mind that's what he meant. Henry Kissinger pressured Helms at least one time. It could have been 100, but modestly he says at least once. Edward Bennett Williams was the attorney for Richard Helms and provided information to the Senate Committee of detailed information of the plans of Nixon and Kissinger for the plans to murder Allende. Now, Edward Bennett Williams is also the attorney for Marvin Davis of 20th Century Fox, that put Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford on the board, and for the John Hinckley, who shot President Reagan, that would have made CIA Vice President Bush president. To get back to the story, the CIA director Richard Helms was no innocent about CIA assassination. Starting in 1960, according to Seymour Hersh, he was aware of the efforts of the CIA of plans for assassinations. And 60 is when John Kennedy won the election against Richard Nixon. And he mentions the plans of getting rid of Castro, but the CIA killed every head of state they wanted, and Castro is still living. But the anti-Castro Cubans that didn't kill Castro killed Kennedy, and the date they were formed with Robert Mayhew and John Rosselli and Sam Giancana and Richard Helms was at the time that Kennedy won the election against Richard Nixon, who was so great in bringing these Nazis to the country. On specific orders to kill, Helms said, I think any of us would have found it difficult to discuss the assassination with the president. We all had the feeling that we are hired to keep those things out of the Oval Office. All the president has to say, the technique is we wish he wasn't there. We talked about assassinations in 1969 or 1970. It was embarrassing in the White House. There was an uproar over the revelations of Castro, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Henry Kissinger had planned the murder of Thieu in South Vietnam if he botched up the peace conference. And, of course, I could list the other murders like Diem that were part of their list, but we don't have time tonight. Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig were involved in these plans. He said the stakes were high. He said regarding the highest level of assassination talk, the stakes would warrant steps we had not contemplated since 1963. Now, what do you think happened in 1963? And I've done broadcasts about Alexander Haig and his role in the Pentagon and with the Bay of Pigs operators and the promise they'd have Cuba again. What Seymour Hersh is saying, and he's done brilliant work on many, many things and written a book on chemical deposits and so forth I'll share with you. He said regarding the discussion of the murder of Allende and the embarrassment of the Lumumba and these other murders, Patrice Lumumba, the other murders that came out, regarding the highest level of assassination talk, the stakes would warrant steps we have not contemplated since 1963. Does that jump at you on the anniversary of Kennedy's death? Henry Kissinger and Haig were involved in these plans. Well, who is Kissinger? He's Fritz KRAEMER again, and going back to 63. And next week I'm going to do the military history of Henry Kissinger. Seymour Hersh talks about his military covert action while he was still at Harvard. And then he came to Harvard, and who put him at Harvard? Fritz KRAEMER, and he was the darling of Harvard. So, and more next week on Haig and Kissinger, and always on Fritz KRAEMER, till we know if Hitler's Fritz KRAEMER, the chief of his staff, the man working with Otto Skorzeny, who lived to set up the Odessa, is the man in the White House with the Pentagon through the chicanery of the era since the end of World War II. I believe, as I say, it is the same man, and this new information by Mr. Drucker about KRAEMER is very important. There's a Yiddish word that means dreck, so I'm tempted to call Mr. Drucker Drecker, but we'll settle for Drucker. That's his name. This is Mae Brussell. It is KAZU FM, and we'll go off the air at this time.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.